Welcome, everyone. Ron Gerber from Angelbeat, bringing you some insights from the other side of the pond. Richard Nugee is one of the top net zero decarbonization experts in Europe, works with a whole array of exciting companies in Europe who are actually rapidly expanding in the US. What I thought would be interesting, especially given the Angelbeat community is probably more focused around North America, is have Richard share with us some insights on what's going on in Europe. I think it's very interesting. You can no longer separate the political landscape from the energy landscape. You got all the tragedies of the Ukrainian, Russian invasion, how it's impacting all of European economies. It's also interesting, you comment a little bit about Germany, which made the strategic decision to emphasize Russian natural gas and de-emphasize its own nuclear power plants. And that decision, while it's sound from a climate perspective, doesn't account for Putin's invasion of Ukraine that suddenly upended the entire European energy landscape. So I wanted to have him focus on that. And then in addition, he works with a very exciting company called CeraPhi. Many people, when they look at renewable energy, look to the sky and solar. What CeraPhi focuses on is geothermal energy and what can we get looking down in the earth to support energy. Again, a great renewable clean energy source. And how do you quite literally tap into that? So Richard, why don't you, with that background, just give a little bit of your history, your professional experience, talk a little bit about the European situation, and talk about one of the companies you work closely with, CeraPhi, and the geothermal opportunities out there. All yours.
Brilliant, Ron. Thanks, and thanks very much for the invitation. A little bit about me. I was a career soldier. I finished sort of very near the top of the UK Ministry of Defence, and before I left the Ministry of Defence, after a long time of interest and reading and so on, I said to the UK Ministry of Defence that they needed to understand the implications of climate change and sustainability. And very briefly, there's two sides to that. If you like, one is the effect of climate change on defence, and the other is the effect of defence on climate change. And the effect of climate change on defence is climate change is going to make the world a more dangerous place because you're going to have scarcity of resources in parts of the world, and you're going to have, as Al Gore says, potentially up to 1 billion migrants leaving areas of the world that they can't live in anymore because they're too hot, of which a proportion will come to Northern Europe, a proportion will come to the United States, and so on. And so there's an implication for our national security from climate change and from the effects it's having on other parts of the world, even if our parts of the world are perhaps slightly lesser affected, or sure, we have more money to be able to do that. But so I spent some time doing that, and I've changed from working for the MOD directly to working for the MOD indirectly, the Ministry of Defence indirectly, but also by trying to bring a lot of new companies into this business of what can we do to try and reduce our carbon emissions at the same time as improve our capability. It's particularly important at the moment, as you've said, Ron, with the energy crisis that's happening in Europe at the moment, and a little bit about that. So by Russia invading Ukraine, European governments see it as an imperative to make sure that Ukraine is sustained as an independent state, and that Russia does not win that war. And therefore, like the US, is supporting Ukraine very significantly in that war. Russia, as a result, have cut off the gas from Nord Stream, the Nord Stream pipeline. They started by saying that it was mechanical failure. Then they just turned around and said they couldn't get the parts because they were being blocked by Europe and by the rest of the world. And now they've just stopped it. It's interesting. Why did Germany put so much store into Nord Stream? I think, and obviously I'm talking from a personal perspective, I'm not part of government and I'm not representing anybody, but Chancellor Merkel in Germany wanted to try and create a good relationship with Russia through trade. And the best way of doing that through trade, and we'd all recognize that as an example, is by buying their oil and gas. That has backfired spectacularly. Yeah. most European countries now, and I can speak definitively about, sort of Germany, France, and Britain now, have basically turned around and said fighting Russia and the effect that that's having is a national decision, and therefore governments should support their people. In order to help in Germany, the Germans have decided, or they are about to decide, I think they have decided, to extend their nuclear power plants by a number of years so that they rely more on nuclear. France is subsidising their oil and their gas by a very significant amount. And the UK announced this morning that they are subsidising, they're putting a cap on the cost for businesses and for private homes of how much they will pay in energy prices. And that is going to cost the UK, some estimates are anywhere between 100 and 150 billion pounds over the next year to 2 years. And of course, that depends on where the prices go. So Europe is taking government action to try and look at this problem. And if you solve this problem, if you look at if government had done nothing, and the UK for the last 4 or 5 weeks have had a government that has been incapable of doing anything because it didn't have a leader, in a sense, our bills would have gone up from an average of about £1,500 a month to they were predicting anything up to £6,000 a month.
Devastating for just about everyone who's not a Kensington millionaire.
Absolutely, and importantly, the cap is only for domestic houses. I heard on the radio this morning a business saying that their bills were £3,000 a month now, and they were looking at anywhere between £30,000 and £60,000 a month for bills. It was a dairy product. Yeah. And that's unsustainable. That will push us into very deep recession, and will push us into companies going bust all over the place. That's why the government has stepped in. But what it's also done in most countries is accelerated renewables, and accelerated a push towards renewables. So the largest wind farm in the world opened up, I think, last month in the North Sea. We are in the process of building a wind farm on a piece of shallow sea called Dogger Bank. Dogger Bank is was the land bridge before the last when all the ice melted a long time ago, thousands of years ago. All the ice melted and the seas were formed in the size they were. When all that ice age was going on, Dogger Bank was a land bridge to the continent of Europe, and we are building what will then again be the largest wind farm in the world on Dogger Bank. So that is accelerating. At times in the UK, we are 100% renewable. When the sun's shining and the wind's blowing, we're 100% renewable for our energy, our electricity, I should say. It averages around about 40% at the moment, 40 to 45% renewable. So we're all sort of looking towards creating more renewables to try and get away from a reliance on gas that is prices set internationally. One of the solutions to that, and one that I'm the chair of the advisory board and I'm very interested in, is a company called CeraPhi, as you mentioned. Yep. CeraPhi have developed a completely new technique of geothermal, and this is what's so exciting about it. Because geothermal, traditionally, you dig 2 wells and you connect the two, usually with an underground reservoir which has got hot water in it, and you pump that hot water up to the surface, you're taking the energy from the water, and you can create heat from taking the hot water up. There are all sorts of problems with that in reality, and it's very expensive. You're digging 2 wells, and they're both expensive. You're pumping subsurface fluids up to the surface, and what you don't know is quite how many toxins there are within that water, and so on. So it has to be dealt with really carefully.
Okay. And is there also even a danger because it could create even minor tremors as you disrupt some of the plates and some of the stability of the Earth? I know
it obviously depends on the geology, but
yeah.
if you're drilling down in two places and removing a substance from the under the surface, there is of course a potential for seismic activity.
Got it. Okay.
It's a bit like fracking in that respect.
Yeah,
there's potential.
It's one of the big downsides, even in a place like Oklahoma that has done so much fracking. There has been a tremendous surge in relatively minor tremors because of that. But go on. Okay.
So what CeraPhi's done is developed a system of geothermal which is on a single borehole. It's called monobore, and it's a closed loop system. So what that means is that the fluid that goes down is the same fluid that comes up, and it works on a cycle. So you're not actually affecting the geology of the Earth, the subsurface at all. All you're doing is drilling down. And of course, like in the US, in fact, the US has, as a percentage, many more than even the UK. We have wells that have been dug in this country onshore. And there's a I think I'm right in saying the figure is about 700 wells in this country which are easily accessible for a monobore single well, putting our proprietary technology down. And all you're doing is you're putting it down to where the heat is. And then the heat of the Earth, you're not affecting that heat at all. You're not, it is there, and it's going to be there for the next 6 billion years. So it might just outlast you and me, Ron. Yeah. But what you're going to get is that heating up a fluid that we put down the well, and then it comes up, it heats, and then it cools down when it's on the surface, and we send it back down again cold, and then it heats up just using the heat of the Earth. Now, depending on how far down you go, it depends on how hot it is. Because if you go down 2-3 kilometers, which is a fairly standard oil drill in this part of the world, you will end up with enough temperature to heat greenhouses, will heat domestic homes on a district heating system, and it lasts effectively forever. There are no moving parts apart from the fluid, and so
you're not taking
renewable.
So you're not taking fluid from the Earth, you're recycling the same fluid in a closed tube or bore. Is that correct?
You could do it with water. Now, there are fluids which are more sophisticated than water that boil at lower temperatures and therefore will hold heat more effectively at around the piece. But the fluid is fluid that we have designed, fluid that we have put into this closed loop system.
Okay.
So the effect on the subsurface geology is zero. All we've done is bore a hole. So there's no chance of any seismic activity at all once you've drilled the hole. There's no interaction with the subsurface at all. All you're doing is effectively you're dropping a thermometer down a hole, but you're using the heat that comes out of that. If you go deeper, and in some places this is perhaps up to 5 or 6 kilometers, the heat is such that you can run a turbine, that you can create electricity. So this is, and the great thing about this design is it doesn't rely on a particular geology to find that heat. So it depends on where the heat is, and there are parts of the Earth's crust that are thinner than others. If you go to Iceland, you can get really, really good heat from about 500 meters down. In parts of the world, you have to go 10 kilometers down to get much heat. So it depends on how big the Earth's crust is as to how far you go down. But you can guarantee that if you go down far enough, you will get heat wherever you are in the world, as long as you can get through the crust.
And what are some of the capacities that one of these drills is? Can it support a home? Can it support a community?
We reckon that if we go down far enough to create electricity, and I'll just use that as an example, a single well will create 5 megawatts of electricity. Consistently 5 megawatts. That's enough for about I think 2,000 homes, if I've got my maths right. So this is now going down. If you're drilling from scratch, that's quite expensive. If you're using at the moment we are using existing oil wells that have run out of oil. Are no longer economically viable to use oil, so they've been capped, and then it becomes a sort of, if you like, a bit of a liability for the company that's done the oil drilling. We're taking them off. We're taking the well off that and making it an asset rather than liability by chucking down our proprietary thing. So the well's already built. Now it'll need securing and all sorts of technical stuff to make sure that we don't lose stuff and that it hasn't shifted with seismic activity. But as long as the well is secure, as long as the well is good, there may not be any oil at the bottom, but of course what there is heat. And therefore we're just taking that heat up. And that is a really cheap way of delivering heat for 6 billion years. I mean, it is basically unlimited in terms of time that the heat's there. The limits will be on on our equipment, how long it survives in that sort of heat. And we think anywhere between, for turbines, 25 years, for our equipment, 100 years, and then you'd replace it. So this is cheap heat, possibly cheap electricity, depending on how deep you go, for 100 years.
Oh, wow. That is exciting. So, and if I'm a big E&P oil exploration company, I'm loving this as a partnership because I've got these assets, I'm still liable. This way I can ensure that at least the surface environmental conditions have to be maintained, and I've got the revenue to justify it. I would imagine companies like CeraPhi not only has this proprietary liquid, they've got all these great mechanical engineers doing the most optimal heat transfer, so there's the minimal amount of power or heat loss when you transfer that heat into turbines. And so that probably makes it probably part of the reason why CeraPhi has its U.S. operations in Houston, where all the big energy and oil companies are.
Absolutely, and we've just gone into partnership, or we're negotiating. I think we've just actually signed to go into partnership with Halliburton to try and do exactly what you're talking about, which is to take advantage of the fact that oil companies actually, once they've run out of oil on that, or it's not viable on that particular drill hole, actually it's a real problem for them. Yeah. They've got to keep them safe. Whereas what we're doing is solving that problem for them and taking heat out through our proprietary technology. So it's a win-win both for oil companies, it's a win-win for us, and it's a win-win more importantly for the environment, because the heat is, the amount of carbon that we're using in order to get that heat is all in securing the drill hole. That's basically it.
Yeah, and you've got that. Now, I was also thinking that to get this started, most oil wells are either in the middle of the ocean where there's lots of sun, or you look at some of the oil fields in West Texas, lots of sun. I can imagine you could probably put in a couple of solar panels to get the system started and have backup batteries. Fairly minimal, again, completely renewable once you put in the capital. Then as the fluid gets circulating up and down and the heat transfer occurs, it's self-sustaining. It's like fusion. It's like the old movies where you don't need any energy added to the system because you're just pulling it out of the earth and you don't need to power the heat transfer and the fluid motion.
That's right. And so this is I think it's a really exciting prospect. And what's interesting is so do a lot of other people. Sure. And we're being actually inundated. We're still a relatively young company. We've been going 2 years. Although I have to say that the chief executive, the top executive directors are all with 20, 30 years experience in the oil and gas industry. And so, this is a very mature startup, if you like.
Having been a roustabout, you probably don't know this about me, but I was a civil engineer in college many years ago. So I worked as a roustabout maintaining pumping units in a city called Conroe, about 40 miles north of Houston, where CeraPhi's based. So I know exactly, when I remember it fondly, when we're replacing pipes, making sure the pumping units are working, we used to go to fields, and a lot of those pumping units are just sitting idle because they've exhausted the oil. So I can personally relate to, and given my involvement in sustainability and clean energy now, I can see where this is so exciting.
And the other thing, which is I think is one of the most exciting, is traditional geothermal relies on the subsurface fluid, and therefore it can only be used in certain places. This technology, this approach that CeraPhi is using, which I think is unique, I don't know of anybody else doing it in the same way, literally can be used anywhere in the world. There is no, now there will be better places for it than others, but it can be used anywhere in the world, because all you're doing is digging down to the heat. Doesn't matter what's in the way, you dig down.
So I would imagine that for at least the next 10, 20 years, CeraPhi doesn't need to do any of its own drilling. There are more than enough. There are tens of thousands of closed oil wells that they can tap into. They don't need to worry about drilling for any time soon.
So there's, you're right, and you're wrong in one respect. You're right in that there are just thousands, hundreds of thousands of oil wells that are no longer in use, which we could go to. But actually, what we've got to think about is what does the customer want? So does the customer want heat? Does the customer want electricity? If we go to an oil well which is deep enough and hot enough so that we can create electricity, because it requires a certain temperature to get to running the turbines, then is that electricity able to be put into the national grid of wherever you are, or the local grid, or is it for a local town or whatever? So it's got to be to a certain extent customer focused rather than just anywhere. But there are enough wells around the world, particularly in the US and Europe, where actually this technology could generate heat for our domestic houses, heat for greenhouses to encourage agriculture where it can't be done before, heat for all sorts of things, as well for industry as well as electricity. And one of the things we're looking at is linking up with desalination plants, linking up with hydrogen creation plants, because actually that electricity is constant. It's what we call in this country, I don't know whether it's the same in the US, we call it base load, which basically means it's there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it takes no moving parts apart from the turbine if you're creating electricity. That's its real beauty.
Interesting. So a couple of final questions for you. Are you also working closely not only with the companies that maintain drilling, but all the transmission companies? Because again, drawing upon my limited experience as a roustabout in the oil fields many years ago, it's one thing when you pump oil out of the ground, all those pumping units are connected to pipes and the oil gets transmitted. For your application in CeraPhi's, do you have to then set up additional transmission lines to connect the energy you're producing at that oil well and have it either available for a town or integrated with the public grid?
Yes. If we go down the electricity route, and we have this great option of electricity or heat. If it's heat, we need to link into a district heating system that either already exists or we create.
Okay.
And it becomes a local heating system. If it's electricity, obviously we need to that has greater opportunity because we can, but we have to link it to the local electricity system. So that's something that we're working on at the moment. We haven't developed that as much because actually. The easier solution and to prove to people that this is a technology worth taking into account, heat is a much easier way of doing it. So, and actually, I'll just add very quickly, yesterday, the British Environmental Audit Committee, which is a committee of our Parliament, sat and had a whole day on geothermal and what is the opportunities for geothermal in the UK. And I know that in parts of Europe, geothermal, and particularly in Germany, geothermal is beginning to really start to ramp up people's priorities because it's an obvious thing to do if you've got the technology.
Got it. And it's easy, as you said, there are thousands of drills out there. There's some concerns about solar in the short term because, again, with all the solar panels being manufactured in China, there are some political connotations of that. Obviously, solar is and hydro and wind are to some degree the three big renewable energy sources. But based on what you said, you could easily geothermal, which has historically been, I guess you call almost a niche renewable energy source, will now become part of what looks like a fourth major source to complement solar, wind, and hydro.
I would like to think so, and of course, there's we've got to develop it, we've got to build it, but yes, but I would say there's one big difference between certainly solar and wind, which is that we in CeraPhi and in the geothermal do not need any rare earths or complex sort of lithium or cobalt or things like that, which we are reliant on other countries, or more importantly, reliant on China to a very large extent to have the raw materials refined. So actually,
that's a very good point.
This is and I go back to what I said right at the beginning. This is almost a national security issue. This is producing a secure energy for the country that has the geothermal in the UK and the US, where you're not reliant on another country for the parts, because there are none that can't be produced locally, or at least within that country. And so that's a really powerful energy security point, which makes geothermal even more important.
Let me ask you one other question, and I appreciate all of your time. With regard to offshore oil rigs, is there an opportunity to use the same technology? You mentioned the North Sea, where there are so many. Here in the US, there's the Gulf of Mexico. Can your technology be applied to some of these platforms that might be looking at their end of life in the near future?
Yes, and we've been asked about 3 or 4 months ago to do a survey of the Magnus oil field, which is off Shetland, in the North Sea, to look at how easy it would be. Now, obviously, it's more difficult because it's more expensive, and if you're only getting heat out of it, you've got transmission loss from the North Sea in the way that you don't have transmission loss for oil, and you wouldn't have much for electricity. So yes, in theory, what we're doing is a survey to see how close to the coast you'd have to be to make heat viable, and that would probably have to be quite close. But how could you generate electricity easily offshore using the existing platforms and the existing oil rigs? So yes, but we're doing a survey to prove it.
Well, this is fascinating. Your comments clearly confirm what we all know, that net zero, climate change, decarbonization is a global issue. The tragedies in Ukraine, the European energy/economic crisis is only going to accelerate these issues. And I think we encourage everyone to at least be aware of what's going on, CeraPhi and geothermal, because when you look at non-fossil fuel alternatives, as you mentioned, batteries are still heavily dependent on terrible mining conditions. It's absolutely better to get an EV, but you read studies, well, what's the supply chain in terms of producing batteries and producing these rare earth? I mean, it's not exactly energy efficient, and there's all kinds of human rights issues. Obviously, net, it's still beneficial, but we encourage everyone to look at that. And Richard, I hope you'll continue to keep me updated on innovative companies coming out of Europe and the UK in this global crisis. And I think it's right now crisis with a capital C, given everything going on. So we appreciate your comments and insights.
Well, Ron, thank you. And I wanted to finish with one thing. It's something I've said to the armed forces. I said, and what I've said is, whatever the reason, whether you believe in climate change or not, and I happen to believe that climate change is a massive problem for us and a national security problem, of course. But whatever the reason, what it is doing is creating innovative technologies that actually end up with energy being much, much, much cheaper. And geothermal is a classic example of that. once you've got the well, and if it's already dug, even better, actually the heat coming out of the earth is free. And so what you've got is, by moving to renewables, what you're getting is much, much, much cheaper energy. And I think that's the real key. It doesn't matter whether you believe in climate change or not. The fact is that these new technologies coming along are offering us opportunities that we've never had before. And we should embrace them as much as possible.
Yep. Necessity is absolutely the mother of invention, and we're seeing it play out in real terms. Well, if anyone has any questions, you can always contact me, Ron Gerber at Angelbeat, #Angelbeat. Glad to put you in touch with Richard or CeraPhi. And we look forward to future conversations with Richard. Maybe he'll come over during a CeraPhi board meeting. We'll have him speak in another program. But I really appreciate your insights, as we are quite literally all in this together.
Brilliant, Ron. Thank you. And thanks for the opportunity. What a great program you've got.
Good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye.